From a distance, Magnolia Veil looked like a dream. White columns gleamed against a sky painted gold by the Georgia sun. The grass shimmered like emerald silk, and when the wind passed through, the air itself seemed perfumed, thick with the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. But that scent wasn't just sweetness. It was warning. Locals used to say, when the magnolia smells too strong, death walks the hill. They didn't whisper it out of superstition. They said it because every time that fragrance rolled down from the house, thick, syrupy, impossible to escape, someone disappeared. The plantation was a world split clean in two. Above the hill, the mansion glowed with laughter, polished shoes, and the clinking of silver. Below it, in the quarters, there was only the creak of wood, the hiss of mosquitoes, and the quiet knowledge that peace never lasted long. Every man and woman working those fields knew the pattern. The nights before the vanishings were always too quiet. The air would grow heavy, like the sky was holding its breath. The dogs wouldn't bark. The horses would sweat without running. And before dawn, that smell, magnolia, fat and sickly sweet, would seep under every door. On one of those nights, a girl named Annie woke up before the rooster. Not from rest, from fear. The scent had found her in her sleep. It slid into her lungs, and she knew what it meant. She rose from her cot, bare feet hitting the cold, damp wood, and stepped outside. The world was still. No wind, no sound, just the moon hanging low like a pale coin. Across the yard, she saw Lazaro, her brother, sitting by the water barrel. His eyes were open, fixed on the dirt. "She came out last night," he whispered. Annie froze. "Who?" "Miss Voss." Just stood there, watchin'. Neither spoke after that. They didn't have to. When the lady of the house came out at night, someone was always chosen by morning. By sunrise, Magnolia Veil came alive again, elegant, orderly, cruelly beautiful. The overseer's bell rang, whips cracked, and the fields swallowed the voices of those forced to work them. To the untrained eye, it was another day of southern grace. But to those below, every sound carried a tremor of dread. As the sun climbed, the air thickened with heat and perfume. Sweat clung to skin like honey, the scent of magnolia pushing through every breath. Annie's eyes drifted toward the house on the hill. Its white walls gleamed like bone. Somewhere inside, breakfast was being prepared. Eggs, bananas, honey. Her stomach turned. She didn't know it yet, but that morning meal would mark the beginning of the end, not just for her brother, but for the house itself. Because once the magnolia bloomed too sweet, it never stopped until blood answered it. She was the kind of woman who could quiet a room without saying a word. Elenina Voss, mistress of Magnolia Veil, born of French blood, raised in southern wealth, and polished by years of learning exactly how to be adored. Her voice never rose above a murmur, yet every command reached the farthest field. Her dresses were always white, her gloves always spotless, and her smile, gentle, unbothered, never betrayed the truth behind her eyes. To the townsfolk, she was elegance itself. The church ladies whispered about her grace. The men tipped their hats as her carriage passed. But those who lived beneath her roof knew something colder, an absence that hummed behind her beauty. She had a strange ritual, one no proper lady would admit to. Once a month, she dismissed the kitchen staff and cooked alone. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She said it was for her husband. A gesture of love. A tradition. But everyone on the plantation knew that whenever Miss Voss tied her apron strings, someone went missing. The first time, no one questioned it. A field hand named Elijah, strong as an ox, was gone by dawn. They said he'd been sold. But his things were still in the cabin. His sandals, his knife, and a thin trail of blood that led toward the house before vanishing into the dirt. Over time, that pattern became legend. Always the strongest men. Always before her private breakfast. Always silence afterward. Her husband, Thomas Voss, never asked. He was too proud, too drunk, too pleased by the meal that appeared before him each month. Eggs golden as sunrise, bananas glazed in dark honey. He called it Ellie's mercy. He said she put love in everything she touched. He was half right. One morning, a house servant carrying linens glanced into the kitchen and froze. Miss Voss stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, face serene, stirring something thick and glistening in a copper pot. She looked up, met the girl's eyes, and smiled, a slow, knowing curve of the lips that said, "You saw nothing." The next day, that servant was gone too. The air around Elenina was like perfume, beautiful, suffocating, impossible to escape. Even her husband once said her scent lingered long after she left a room. What he didn't know was that it wasn't perfume at all. It was the magnolia, the same heavy sweetness that always appeared before death. At night, when the candles burned low, she would sit by the window, combing her hair with an ivory brush carved from the tusk of an elephant her father had hunted. Her reflection glowed in the mirror. White silk, pale hands, eyes that never blinked too long. The kind of woman who could pass for a saint if you never saw her standing in the moonlight with blood drying on her wrists. At Magnolia Veil, time didn't pass. It circled, like a vulture waiting for what it already knew would die. Every few weeks, it began again. The strange silence, the perfume of magnolia rolling through the quarters, the glances exchanged in fear more than words ever could. The enslaved people didn't need to be told when the next man would vanish. They could feel it in the air. The strongest were always chosen. Men with broad shoulders, calloused hands, backs like carved wood. The kind of men who could break chains if they weren't so tired. The kind of men who gave others a sense of safety. And that's exactly why their absence hit hardest. Sometimes they were taken at night. Sometimes, in the early morning, when mist still hugged the fields. But the ending was always the same. The sound of footsteps, a door closing, and by dawn, an empty cot. No one ever saw them leave. No one ever saw them return. Those who dared to whisper about it said Miss Voss chose with her eyes. She would walk among them some evenings, gloved hands grazing the cotton plants, pale dress glowing in the half-light. She never spoke. She only looked. And that look alone was enough to silence laughter for days. Then, before sunrise, her kitchen windows would glow. The scent of cooked fruit, eggs, and honey would drift down the hill, mixing with magnolia until the air itself felt poisoned by sweetness. Once, a child asked her mother why it smelled like flowers when people disappeared. The woman slapped her gently and said, "Don't name what feeds her." The plantation learned to live by superstition because the truth was worse. They stopped whistling. They stopped singing. Even the birds went quiet on magnolia mornings. Annie watched all of it with eyes that saw more than she let on. She had lost friends, cousins, neighbors. Every disappearance carved a hollow in her chest, but nothing prepared her for the day the silence came for her own blood. Lazaro, her brother, her protector, the only person who still called her Little Storm. He had always told her, "We ain't born just to bow." Now he sat by the door each night, eyes fixed on the path that led to the house. Like he was waiting, like he already knew. When Miss Voss came to the quarters that evening, dressed in white silk that shimmered beneath the lantern glow, every soul stopped breathing.
She didn't speak.
She just lifted one hand and pointed at Lazaro. No one screamed. No one begged. Because at Magnolia Veil, begging never worked. He stood, kissed his sister's forehead, and followed her up the path without a sound. By morning, his bed was empty, and the magnolia smelled stronger than ever. That night, Annie didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her cabin, hands clasped, staring at the empty cot across from her. Lazaro's shirt still hung on the wall. His sandals were neatly placed by the door, waiting for feet that would never return. The air inside the room was thick, too still, too quiet. Even the crickets outside seemed to know what had happened. In the distance, the house glowed faintly on the hill like a ghost lantern. From its chimney, smoke curled upward in thin ribbons. And underneath it, a smell, sweet, heavy, nauseating, slid across the fields. Magnolia and honey. Annie pressed a hand to her mouth. She didn't need to see what was being cooked to understand. Her stomach twisted, her eyes filled, and yet she refused to cry. Because crying didn't bring anyone back. Not here. Not ever. When morning came, the overseer's bell stayed silent. The fields lay untouched. The dogs wouldn't move. The air felt wrong, thick as syrup, and the people in the quarters moved as if carrying stones in their chests. But Annie wasn't numb anymore. Something inside her had shifted, slowly, quietly, like a door opening in the dark. As she stepped outside, an old woman named Sina, the midwife, was waiting. Her eyes, cloudy with age, still held a sharpness that cut through time itself. "He's gone, child," Sina said softly. Annie nodded. "I know." She chose him. "Yes." "Then you must choose too." Annie frowned. "Choose what?" Sina reached beneath her shawl and pulled out a small pouch tied with red string. Inside it rattled something, herbs, bone, maybe a prayer. "Your mother once gave me this," the old woman whispered. "Said it belonged to your bloodline. The ones who remember before the chains." Annie looked at her, unsure whether to believe or break. "Before the chains?" she echoed. Sina nodded. "There are things the white folks took. Names, songs, tongues. But some of us kept what can't be whipped away. It sleeps until it's needed." She pressed the pouch into Annie's palm. "Now it's needed." That night, as the plantation slept, Annie walked toward the hill. Her body trembled, but not from fear. The magnolia scent wrapped around her like smoke, but she didn't turn away. For years, she'd lived by silence. Obedience was survival. But as she stood beneath the shadow of the house that had devoured her brother, that silence began to crack. Somewhere inside those white walls, something human had been turned into ritual. And she was done watching. In the distance, thunder murmured, though the sky was clear. Annie raised her head, her fingers tightening around the red pouch. If the Lady of Magnolia Veil could take, then Annie could take back. The wind carried the faintest sound then, like whispering voices rising from the roots beneath her feet. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. The door to the root cellar opened with a sound too soft for what it was hiding. Annie had waited until the house fell silent, until even the dogs had stopped pacing, until the magnolia scent hung thick as fog. She'd slipped past the kitchens, past the storage room, down into the earth beneath Magnolia Veil. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The air felt damp, unnatural. Not the cool of soil, but the chill of something that had forgotten sunlight. Her candle flickered, casting nervous light against the stone walls. Then she saw it. Rows of glass jars lined a wooden shelf, their contents floating in murky liquid. Some held fragments of muscle, others bone, sinew, things that could once have been part of a man. Each jar bore a label written in perfect cursive: Subject E. Hampton. Subject R. Essex. Subject L. Voss. Her brother's name. Her knees nearly buckled. The candle trembled in her hand. For a long moment, she could only stare at the neat handwriting, the clinical order of it all. No emotion, no mercy. Just inventory. On a nearby table lay tools. Metal, sharp, shining even in the dim light. The kind a surgeon might use, or someone who pretended to be one. The table surface was dark-stained, not by time, but by use. She moved closer. The smell hit her, sweet, chemical, rotten. And underneath it, something metallic, unmistakable. Blood. A ledger sat open beside the instruments, pages filled with tight, precise notes. Specimen displays prime yield. Sedation not required. Extraction successful. Annie's breath caught. Her hands shook as she turned another page. Subject compliant. Primary stored. Disposal pending. Her brother hadn't been sold. He hadn't been punished. He had been harvested. She stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. The sound echoed through the small stone chamber like a scream. The candlelight wavered wildly, and then, for a split second, something moved behind her. She froze. At first she thought it was her reflection in the glass jars, but it wasn't. A shape was forming in the corner, not solid, not shadow, but something in between. It pulsed with faint light, like a heartbeat made visible. Then came a whisper. Low, broken, like a breath forced through water. Annie. Her blood ran cold. That voice. It was him. Lazaro. The shape tilted its head, almost human, almost real. Its arm lifted slowly and pointed toward the far wall, toward a wooden box half hidden beneath a blood-stained cloth. Annie knelt and pulled the cover back. Inside were bundles of braided hair, tied with scraps of fabric. Dozens of them. Every lock a life. Every strand a name. Her breath trembled, but her eyes hardened. She looked back to where the shadow had been, but it was gone. The cellar felt heavier now, not empty, but crowded, as though every lost soul was standing beside her. She whispered, "I see you." And the flame on her candle rose higher, as if answering her back. Annie couldn't sleep after leaving the cellar. Sleep was for the safe, and no one in Magnolia Veil was safe anymore. She sat on the floor of her cabin, back straight, the stolen pages of Elenina's ledger spread across her lap like sacred text. Each line was written in the same careful hand, neat, unfeeling, beautiful in the way only cruelty can be. There were no names, just numbers. No people, only subjects. Each record was a life broken into anatomy, written with a surgeon's calm. Specimen retained for extraction. Volume high. Blood thick. Tissue viable. Annie traced the words with her fingertips, her pulse hammering. These weren't random killings. They were experiments, organized, measured, perfected. Miss Voss hadn't acted from madness. She'd acted from method. Every few pages, Annie found strange notes in the margins, sketches of veins, measurements of organs, scribbles of symbols that weren't English or Latin. Something older, carved from another tongue. Whatever this was, it wasn't just cruelty, it was ritual. By the third page, her eyes blurred from tears and exhaustion. She turned another sheet and froze. There it was. Her brother's name. Subject L. Voss. Extraction successful. Musculature ideal. Sedation not required. Her throat closed. Her vision went red. She wanted to tear the paper, to burn it, to scream. But she didn't. Instead, she kept reading because she had to understand. A few pages later, her heart stopped again. Her own name. Subject A. Voss. Projected December. Unusual lineage. Haitian maternal line. Likely vessel. Vessel. The word crawled under her skin like a parasite. It wasn't just a name on a list, it was a prophecy. She wasn't meant to die like the others. She was meant to hold something. To continue whatever Elenina had started. Her breath quickened. The air in the cabin seemed to tilt. She pressed a hand against her chest to steady herself, but her pulse thudded so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. Vessel. Vessel for what? She thought of the jars. The honey. The rituals. The way Elenina's husband ate each month, unaware of what he was consuming. The idea struck her like lightning. The woman wasn't just killing them. She was feeding him. Keeping him alive through sacrifice. Feeding him the bodies, the blood, the souls of the men she'd destroyed. Annie clutched the pages to her chest, rocking slightly, whispering through her teeth. She took him. She took all of them. And then, something inside her cracked, not from grief, but from rage. The kind that doesn't burn quickly but slow, steady, ancient. She gathered the pages, tied them in cloth, and whispered a promise. Not one more. Not me. Not again. Outside, the magnolias swayed though there was no wind. The air seemed to tremble, as if the land itself had heard her vow. Magnolia Veil had taken lives for years. Tonight, the dead would take something back. For 3 nights, the wind refused to move. The air around Magnolia Veil hung heavy as if the world itself were holding its breath. The magnolia trees stood still, their blossoms drooping like pale faces, and the moon poured a ghostly light across the fields that never quite touched the ground. Inside her cabin, Annie sat cross-legged on the floor. The pouch Sina had given her lay open. Inside, ash bone, something that shimmered like ground glass, and a smell older than the house itself. She didn't know the words her mother once used, but she remembered the rhythm. the hum that rose from her throat like thunder from the belly of the earth. At first, it was only sound. Then came the whispers. They crawled from the corners of the room, soft and unsure, like people remembering how to speak. Men's voices. Low, cracked, carrying pain that had never been buried. She didn't look up. She just whispered back, "I remember you." The candle flame beside her wavered sideways, though there was no wind. The temperature dropped. Her breath fogged the air. One by one, the shadows on the walls began to move. Not flicker, move. They stretched, curled, reached. Annie didn't scream. She didn't beg. She welcomed them. "These are your bones," she said. "Your names. Your blood. She took you piece by piece. Now take back what's yours." The room trembled. The fire shrank to a blue spark. The sound that filled the space was not one voice, but many, whispers blending into something like breathing, like an army inhaling at once. Her mother had told her once, in a whisper she was never meant to remember, "The body dies, but the story stays. The story can fight." And that night the stories did. The floor beneath her began to hum, a low vibration running through the boards into her bones. The candlelight bent, forming outlines, shoulders, hands, faces half-formed by smoke and sorrow. Annie lifted her chin. Her eyes were wet, but steady. "You will not be forgotten." A pulse answered her, one beat, deep and resonant, echoing through the cabin walls. It wasn't the sound of hearts. It was the sound of return. The shadows drew closer, circling her in silence. She could feel them, not cold, not warm, but present. They didn't need bodies anymore. They had hers. When the first light of dawn crept across the sky, Annie stepped outside. The world looked the same cotton fields, the same shacks, the same house on the hill, but something was different. The birds didn't sing. The magnolia trees bowed as she passed. The wind itself seemed to move with her. She wasn't alone anymore. Every step she took carried the weight of the ones who had been stolen. Every breath she drew belonged to both the living and the dead. Magnolia Veil had awakened its ghosts. And this time, they weren't leaving quietly. By the seventh night, Annie no longer trembled. Fear had burned out of her body, leaving only focus, sharp, steady, cold as steel. The ghosts no longer whispered. They waited. She rose before dawn and dressed in silence. Her eyes were hollow but alive, reflecting the faintest trace of flame from the small circle of ash drawn on her cabin floor. In that circle, the bone charm glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with her heart. The time had come to return to the house. She crept across the fields, barefoot, the dew cold against her feet. No dogs barked. No overseer stirred. Magnolia Veil slept, unaware that its heartbeat was about to stop. The kitchen door yielded easily. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, spices, and that same sweet honeyed perfume that once meant death. Miss Voss had already begun her preparations. The silver pots gleamed. The stove hummed. And on the table, eggs, bananas, and the black jar of honey that shimmered like oil. Annie moved like a shadow, unseen among the others. She had tied her hair beneath a scarf, hidden her face in the smoke. To anyone else, she was just another kitchen girl. When Elenina entered, the room froze. White silk, pale gloves, a smile too soft to trust. She carried herself like a queen among servants, her every step measured, deliberate. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeves and began to cook. Every movement was ritual. Crack the eggs. Slice the fruit. Stir the honey. Each act a prayer, not to God, but to whatever dark thing she served. Annie watched. She studied. And then, when Elenina turned her back, she moved. From beneath her apron, she pulled a small vial, one she had made herself from herbs, ash, and blood drawn from her own palm. A reversal charm. Not poison, not death, truth. A single drop could turn any lie inside out. She poured it into the honey. The black syrup shimmered, changed for just a heartbeat, then stilled. When Elenina turned back, her hand brushed the spoon, stirring again, unaware. Annie stepped away, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The other women in the kitchen kept their eyes down. They didn't see. They didn't need to. The air had already shifted. When the plate was finished, golden eggs, glazed bananas, dark honey gleaming like sin, Evelina smiled faintly, as if pleased with herself. She lifted the tray, elegant and composed, and left for the dining room. Annie exhaled. Her knees nearly gave. But she didn't follow. Not yet. Outside, the magnolia trees began to move, though there was no wind. The blossoms shivered, shedding petals like snow. The air turned heavy, electric. The ritual wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to every man who'd vanished, every ghost who'd waited, every woman who'd buried silence in her throat. As the first bell of morning rang, Annie whispered into the still air, "Eat and remember." The breakfast room was bathed in gold that morning, sunlight pouring through lace curtains, glinting off the polished silverware, off the porcelain plates that had never known hunger. To anyone else, it looked like grace. But grace has a smell, and today it was spoiled. Evelina Voss stood at the head of the table, hands folded, face serene. Across from her, her husband Thomas waited, napkin tucked neatly into his collar, a smile on his lips that never reached his eyes. She placed the dish before him, eggs shining like molten gold, bananas sliced and glazed in black honey that gleamed like a mirror. Thomas leaned forward, breathed in deep. "Smells divine," he said. Evelina smiled, a smile rehearsed, brittle. "It's my finest yet." He lifted his fork, and the house shuddered. It was subtle at first, like a gust of wind passing through the walls. Then the chandelier trembled. The floorboards beneath his chair groaned. The honey on the plate began to bubble, slow, viscous, as if alive. Thomas frowned. "Ellie?" She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught. The air thickened, heavy as smoke. From somewhere deep below, in the bones of the house, came a low, guttural sound. Not thunder, not wind, breathing. Then came the whisper, "We remember." The color drained from Evelina's face. She backed away from the table, knocking over her chair. The honey on the plate split open, spilling across the linen in black veins that moved like roots, spreading outward, climbing the table legs, crawling up her skirt. She screamed, grabbing the edge of the table for balance, but the wood beneath her hand burned hot. The polished floor split like skin, releasing a hiss of steam and the stench of iron. Thomas stumbled to his feet, choking on the smell. "What is this?" he shouted, but his wife was staring past him, toward the kitchen doorway. Annie stood there, barefoot, ash-streaked, eyes like fire. "You took the wrong ones," Annie said quietly. Evelina shook her head, trembling. "You don't understand." "I understand everything." The wind tore through the room, shattering the windows. Candles flared with green fire. The portraits on the walls began to bleed, paint melting into red streaks. Then the cellar door burst open. Out poured shadows, not smoke, not figures, but memories. The men she'd stolen, twisted, erased. Their silhouettes filled the room, bending light, whispering, breathing. Thomas collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. Evelina screamed, clutching at her face, as the shadows circled her. They didn't touch her. They just closed in, slow, inevitable, suffocating. Annie's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sure. "You fed him with their bodies. Now you will feed them." The honey surged upward, coating Evelina's hands, her mouth, her throat. She clawed at it, gasping, choking, until her white dress turned black. The shadows swallowed her whole. The house shook one final time. The walls cracked. The ceiling caved. And Magnolia Veil screamed. By dawn, Magnolia Veil was nothing but a skeleton of smoke. The house that once shone like ivory now burned slow, deliberate, almost reverent, as if fire itself wanted to take its time remembering. Every beam cracked like bone. Every window shattered like confession. The air carried the scent of magnolia and honey, twisted now into something scorched and honest. Annie stood barefoot in the dirt, her skin streaked with ash, her eyes wide and calm. She didn't move. She didn't have to. Behind her, the others gathered, men, women, children, the living and the ghosts alike. No overseer barked orders. No bells rang. The chains behind the smokehouse hung still and silent, their rust shining in the new sun. For the first time, the plantation was quiet for the right reason. The wind shifted, carrying whispers through the ruins, voices that were neither mournful nor vengeful. Just free. Ezra, the scarred man who had once been broken by Elenina's cruelty, stood beside Annie now. His eyes were hollow, but not empty. He looked at her and nodded once. She nodded back. No words, just recognition, the kind that exists between survivors. Behind them, the magnolia trees began to wither. Their petals browned and fell, carpeting the blackened ground in white. The smell that had once haunted the enslaved now faded into clean air. Annie turned away from the fire and walked toward the back garden, the one Miss Voss had once kept perfect, where roses bloomed in impossible symmetry. Now it was wild, overgrown, alive in a way it had never been before. At its center, beneath a rotted tree stump, she began to dig. Her hands tore at the soil until her fingers struck wood. A small box. Inside, braids of hair, bits of bone, torn journal pages, cloth stained with names in dried blood. Every piece a fragment of someone who had been erased. She poured them all into the earth. Then she placed Lazaro's carving, the unfinished horse, at the center. Her fingers brushed the rough edges, and for the first time since his death, she smiled. "This is where you rest," she whispered. "All of you." She covered the grave with soil, pressed her palm flat over it, and felt a faint pulse beneath her skin. Not violent, just steady. Like breath. Like acknowledgement. The others came forward, one by one, each leaving something small, a torn cloth, a button, a fragment of rope. No one prayed. They didn't need to. The act itself was the prayer. When the last offering was laid, Annie straightened and turned to the people. Her voice was low, but it carried through the smoke. "They called this land Magnolia Veil," she said. "But that name belonged to her, to what she built on our pain. It ends here." No one asked what the new name would be. They didn't have to. They already knew. As the sun climbed higher, its light touched the burned walls, the field, the grave, and finally, Annie's face. The story of Magnolia Veil had ended. But the earth, at last, remembered.